For weeks now, Donald Trump has been escalating his warnings: economic threats, diplomatic pressure, military rhetoric, and yet nothing is changing. No retreat, no agreement, no major reaction from the other side. And now, one detail is starting to alarm Washington. The louder Trump gets, the more his adversaries seem to ignore him. We may be witnessing a much bigger geopolitical shift than anyone expected. Because the moment an ultimatum no longer creates fear, it starts looking like weakness. For several weeks, Donald Trump has been steadily raising the pressure. At first, many believed it was simply classic political theater, a way to reassert dominance and show that he wanted to regain control of the global balance of power. But as the days go by, one detail becomes impossible to ignore: the threats keep coming, without producing the expected effect. This so called seventh ultimatum marks a turning point precisely because it comes after a long series of already aggressive warnings, promises of economic sanctions, hints of military retaliation, constant diplomatic pressure. Trump has practically used the entire American arsenal of intimidation to impose his red lines. And yet, nobody seems to panic. That's what is shocking many observers in Washington today. Normally, when a former US president, especially someone like Trump, repeatedly issues public threats, markets react, allies become nervous, and adversaries slow down. But this time, silence dominates. And inside geopolitical circles, that silence is beginning to be interpreted as an extremely dangerous signal. Because in reality, an ultimatum only works if the other side believes you are truly willing to follow through. The moment that fear disappears, the entire deterrent system starts collapsing. And that may be exactly what is happening right now. Iran continues increasing pressure across the region. China keeps expanding its military demonstrations around Taiwan. And Russia is closely watching how the United States reacts to every new provocation. In other words, Washington's adversaries are gradually testing America's limits. And Trump now faces a major problem because he built his entire international image around one simple idea: being unpredictable, aggressive, and willing to go further than previous American presidents. For years, that strategy worked. Many world leaders preferred avoiding escalation because they feared Trump could make a brutal decision at any moment. But today, that fear seems weaker than before. And for Washington, that may be the most alarming signal of all. Because when a superpower starts losing its ability to intimidate, the danger is no longer just diplomatic. The real danger is that it may feel forced to prove its credibility through action. A strike, a military operation, a show of force impossible to ignore. And that is exactly why this seventh ultimatum is creating so much tension. Because at this stage, Trump may no longer be speaking just to apply pressure. He may be reaching the moment where he has to prove whether he's bluffing or not. What is happening right now is highly unusual. For decades, American power relied on a very simple mechanism. When a US president issued a serious warning, most countries preferred avoiding direct confrontation. Because behind every American threat stood overwhelming military power, global economic dominance, and above all, a reputation for rapid intervention. But today, that mechanism appears far less effective. And several world capitals are clearly beginning to test this new reality. Take Iran, for example. For months, Tehran has been acting with far more confidence across the region. Iran-backed groups continue their operations, maritime tensions are rising, and despite repeated American warnings, Tehran's strategy has barely changed. Why? Because many in Iran believe Washington is desperate to avoid a full-scale war in the Middle East, a war that could send oil prices soaring, destabilize global markets, and trigger a massive political crisis inside the United States. In other words, Iran is betting that America is bluffing more than before. And this calculation goes far beyond the Middle East. China is making a similar assessment. Beijing is carefully watching every Trump statement, every American military movement, and every sign of hesitation coming from Washington. And from China's perspective, the United States now appears overstretched on too many fronts at once: Ukraine, Taiwan, Iran, internal economic tensions, massive debt, political polarization. For Beijing, this creates a historic opportunity. gradually push its regional ambitions while avoiding immediate direct confrontation. It is a slow, methodical strategy, but an extremely effective one. Meanwhile, Russia is observing this entire power struggle with great interest because Moscow has understood something essential. The more America's rivals resist collectively, the harder it becomes for Washington to impose its will everywhere at the same time. And that is where the situation becomes truly dangerous, because this is no longer just about diplomatic threats. We are entering a phase where several powers are beginning to believe that America's limits can be tested without immediate consequences. Historically, these moments are often extremely unstable. Why? Because when a superpower sees its warnings repeatedly ignored, it may eventually decide it needs to act aggressively to restore credibility. And that is precisely the trap slowly closing around Trump. If he continues threatening without acting, he risks reinforcing the perception that his ultimatums no longer matter. But if he finally decides to act, even in a limited way, he could trigger an escalation far more difficult to control. And that is what worries many military analysts today. The growing feeling that every major actor is playing with red lines, hoping the other side will back down at the last moment. The problem is that in this type of confrontation, a single miscalculation can change everything. The real danger today is not just rising tensions. The real danger is that Washington appears trapped in a situation where every option carries serious risks. And Donald Trump now finds himself at the center of that problem. Because by multiplying ultimatums, he has created enormous expectations around America's response. Every statement creates the impression that a major reaction could happen at any moment. But the more those expectations grow, the higher the political cost of backing down becomes. That is where the trap truly begins to close. If Trump does nothing after repeatedly making threats, America's adversaries may interpret it as strategic weakness. And in global power, politics, perceived weakness often invites even more provocations. In other words, the more Washington hesitates, the more some countries may feel encouraged to push even further. But on the other hand, if Trump responds aggressively to restore American authority, he risks triggering a chain reaction that could quickly spiral out of control. And that is what makes the current situation so unstable. Because today, the United States is not dealing with just one crisis. It is managing several major crises simultaneously. In the Middle East, tensions surrounding Iran remain explosive. In Asia, the Taiwan issue continues bringing Washington and Beijing into direct confrontation. In Europe, the war in Ukraine continues consuming enormous military and diplomatic resources. And at the same time, internal political divisions inside the United States are becoming deeper and deeper. From the outside, many of Washington's adversaries now see an America under pressure on every front at once. And that completely changes their strategic calculations. In the past, many countries feared an immediate and overwhelming American response. Today, some believe Washington is desperate to avoid another major war at all costs. That perception is exactly what encourages several powers to test America's limits more aggressively. And the more these tests continue, the greater the risk of a major incident becomes. A drone shot down, a naval interception, a strike misunderstood by the other side, an intelligence failure. In the current climate, any one of these incidents could escalate within hours. That is what deeply worries many military officials today. The growing sense that the world is entering a phase where nobody truly wants full-scale war. But everyone keeps raising the level of confrontation. Historically, these are often the most dangerous moments, because major crises do not always begin with carefully planned decisions. Very often, they begin through accumulated tensions, demonstrations of force, and catastrophic miscalculations. Right now, Washington appears determined to maintain maximum pressure without crossing the breaking point. But the more Trump escalates his threats, the closer that breaking point gets. And the question now worrying many diplomats is simple. Does the United States still control the escalation? Or is it slowly being pulled into a dynamic that nobody can stop anymore? Behind this series of ultimatums, there is another battle unfolding, one that may be even more important, a battle of image, a battle of authority, and above all, a political battle. Because Donald Trump is not speaking only to foreign leaders. He is also speaking to America itself. For years, his message has been built around one central idea: that the United States lost its strength, its respect, and its ability to impose its will on the rest of the world. And he presents himself as the man capable of restoring that dominance. That is why every statement is so dramatic. Every ultimatum is designed as a demonstration of power. Trump wants to appear as the leader who refuses weak compromises, the one willing to go further than previous American presidents ever dared to go. The problem is that many foreign leaders now fully understand this strategy. They know Trump needs to project an image of unpredictability and extreme toughness in order to maintain his political identity. And some of them are beginning to use that strategy against him. How? By refusing to react immediately. Because in geopolitics, ignoring a threat can sometimes be more effective than confronting it directly. When a leader raises the pressure and nobody moves, doubt begins to appear. Doubt about his real willingness to act, doubt about his actual limits, and most importantly, doubt about what is bluff and what is genuine military intent. That is exactly what seems to be happening right now. Iran avoids direct overreaction while continuing to advance its regional strategy. China keeps a calm public tone while steadily pushing its influence around Taiwan. And Russia allows the tensions to grow while carefully observing how Washington handles this permanent escalation. In other words, America's rivals are not necessarily seeking immediate war. They are testing American credibility over the long term. And the more ultimatums pile up without visible consequences, the more that credibility risks eroding. That is the core problem facing Trump today, because he built his entire international political image around absolute strength, around the idea that nobody would dare openly challenge the United States under his leadership. But now that image is being tested publicly. And in this kind of confrontation, perception becomes almost as important as military reality itself. If allies begin doubting America's ability to enforce its red lines, the global geopolitical balance could gradually start shifting. Because alliances are built on trust: trust in American protection, trust in America's ability to respond quickly, trust that Washington still controls escalation. And that trust now appears to be under serious pressure. That is why this crisis goes far beyond Trump's statements alone. What we are witnessing is a global psychological war, a battle where every side is trying to convince the other that it is prepared to go further, a battle where nobody wants to appear weak, and a battle where even a small miscalculation could have massive consequences. The most alarming part of this situation may no longer be the threats themselves. The real danger is what happens when a leader feels forced to prove that he is not bluffing. And that is exactly the risk now hanging over Donald Trump. Because after multiple ultimatums that produced little visible reaction, one critical question is beginning to dominate discussions in Washington. How far are the United States actually prepared to go? In global power struggles, there is one moment that is especially dangerous: the moment when a country believes its credibility is collapsing. Once that happens, decision making becomes far more unpredictable. Why? Because a leader may become tempted to launch a dramatic action not necessarily to win a war, but simply to restore fear and prove he is willing to act. And historically, that is often how major escalations begin. Not always through a deliberate desire for total war, but through a limited show of force, a targeted strike, a rapid military operation, an aggressive interception at sea or in the air. The problem is that once the first move is made, events become much harder to control, because no major power wants to appear weak either. If the United States strikes, Iran could respond through allied groups across the region. If tensions around Taiwan escalate, China could rapidly increase its military presence. And in this extremely tense global climate, every crisis could suddenly connect to the others. That is what deeply worries many strategists today: the feeling that the world has entered a phase of permanent hypertension, a phase where everyone keeps testing limits, but nobody truly knows where the final red line is anymore. And the more provocations multiply, the greater the risk of a catastrophic mistake becomes: a faulty intelligence assessment, an emotional reaction after an attack, a military commander misinterpreting an enemy maneuver, a naval accident inside a high-tension zone. Under normal circumstances, these incidents might be contained quickly. But today, With this accumulation of political, military, and media pressure, the danger is far greater. Because every side wants to project strength, every leader wants to avoid looking weak, and every show of force pushes the opposing side to respond even more aggressively. That is what experts call an escalation spiral. And the most dangerous thing about a spiral is that eventually, events start moving faster than the leaders themselves. Right now, Donald Trump continues raising the pressure to show that America remains in control. But behind this posture of strength, one increasingly disturbing question remains. What if the world is entering a phase where nobody truly controls the escalation anymore? Because after so many ignored ultimatums, demonstrations of force, and constantly shifting red lines, the next move may no longer be diplomatic.